Well, we're all recording, mate. So
Nice.
I look forward to seeing how this
I am not
goes.
good at intros, so that's an interesting proposition you've set for me.
Is that your intro then? I'm not good at intros.
It might be. Welcome, Lakeside Drive listeners. I'm not good at intros, so we're not going to do one. James, good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on my own show.
So you've grilled Campy and I ruthlessly.
And Freya.
And Freya, yes. Time to flip it and you're now to be grilled.
Can we chat? Hard!
Yes.
Considering the studio that is recorded and I think is just below this window.
Oh, really?
I think Hard Chat is, or Hard Quiz, sorry, I think is recorded at ABC Melbourne.
Yeah. Right there.
Hi, Tom.
Right over there.
Let's chat hard.
I think you're very good at asking questions a lot of the time, but I think people probably want to know a bit more about the one and only James Baldwin.
I doubt it, but okay.
The one and only James Baldwin.
James Baldwin.
My first question was, why did you decide to start a podcast? And I suppose phrasing that better would be, what was the gap in the market or opportunity you saw for a podcast to be started?
Well, thanks so much for asking me such a wonderful question.
Do what I do. I learned from the best.
Not me. Yeah, I think I fell out of love with Formula One probably a year or two into Daniel being in Red Bull.
Yep.
So 14, 15. So I wasn't interested in Mercedes battle that happened in 16. I think I watched a little bit of that when Rosberg won.
Yep.
And who's also able to now go to Formula One races now that there's no vaccination certificate presenting required.
Awesome.
Good for him.
Make sure he has his badge on so people know who he is.
There is. Oh, it doesn't matter. So I could go for hours. So that was sort of boring to me. And I did this. I had this opportunity to be in a Heineken commercial in 2018. Maybe it was 2017. I can't remember. It was one of those years. Maybe it was 17.
It's all blur.
And I think it was 17. It's all a blur. But I ended up and got paid for this too, which was excellent. But I ended up hanging out with DC, Max Verstappen, and around the Red Bull garage.
Yep.
Being filmed basically for this Heineken commercial. Got absolutely roasted online for it.
As you should.
Absolutely roasted. Like
the Australian way.
The worst acting I've ever seen, everything else, which was fine. I will say the script was absolutely shithouse.
Not working with much.
And I impro'd a lot and got DC laughing a lot. And then, of course, they didn't show any of that.
No.
Because
I mean, it's part of the course. All the Heineken ads are like stale
Horrific.
and rigid, aren't they?
Yeah.
The acting is horrid, but the writing must be just as bad.
So I had a lot of fun, including but not limited to DC opening a Maserati door for me to get into and getting on a helicopter here at Crown Casino and flying across to the Grand Prix.
Pretty cool.
Not having to do the driver pleb thing.
That's
which
not bad.
I always
That's
now
a pretty
have to do.
baller kind of thing to have
It
done.
was epic.
Yes.
And the crew were awesome. The guy I was with was awesome too. And I had a lot of fun. But one of the things that got interested, because that was then the start of the season for the Oz Grand Prix, is that I then suddenly became invested, because here I am. I've got a selfie. I'll edit my own episode. I'll flash the selfie with me and Max Verstappen here. And I was like, oh, I'm actually now connected to these drivers.
Yeah.
Whereas beforehand, I was at a distance, and I didn't live in Melbourne. I grew up in Sydney and Perth. So motorsport was V8 supercars, and that was it. Bathurst was kind of the biggest thing. And then growing up in Perth was kind of like West Coast Eagles or the Dockers. And then Sydney, there's obviously NRL, which I wasn't interested in. So I think it kind of, motorsport was always there for me because Dad loved it. And my dad's a little bit older, and he had gone to like the OG, like Reims Grand Prix kind of thing. Like he's talking about like Jackie Stewart and Jack Brabham and all this kinds of stuff. Like our Legends t-shirt at the top, like that's where he is.
Yeah.
And I'm further down. I think it's quite an interesting like progression.
Yeah.
So falling back into like watching Formula, I wouldn't say I fell back in love with it in 2017, but I certainly watched it a lot.
Yep.
And sort of 2018, then I was like, okay, this is a bit of a vibe. DR won some races in both 17 and 18. And I approached Campy because he and I kind of knew each other. Like, as you said in your episode, the one before this one, we didn't really like the three of us weren't mates together.
Mm.
We sort of accidentally stumbled across what is a
All
really
independent.
good relationship on mic. At least we hate each other off mic. We never talk to each other. It's not like we had a great beer the other day. Yes, Top Gear. But it was. I felt like I would go out looking for content, and I wouldn't find what an Australian opinion for me was.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to say there wasn't Australian podcasts, Box and Neutrals, who I speak about a lot on this show, who are friends of the show. I love those two guys. I think they're great people, but they're very. Michael is he is actually a consummate professional.
Yeah, Campy talks about it, but
he
Michael
actually
is.
And that's the reason why I invited him to do the Extremely podcast with me, because he's just so professional. But and Rob James is the digital manager for Motorsport Australia, so he is a very busy boy and very focused on not saying anything too controversial because of his work. So I felt like there was a gap in the market for a real opinion about Formula One as a whole and as drivers. And one of the things that I wanted to do was talk about everyone.
Yep.
And I'm pretty sure from our first episode all the way to now, we do the team by team analysis.
Yep.
Because no one else was doing it. So I saw that as the gap in the market. And, I put on the tin of the podcast, like I think I said it was Aussie banter,
Daniel Ricciardo bias.
and huge Daniel Ricciardo bias.
Yep.
And big opinions, Aussie banter and Daniel Ricciardo bias were the three things that I put on the podcast for 2 years. And we were true to that.
Yep.
We loved him and he was performing with, I mean, that was Renault, his first year. And we saw him flail and then succeed in that car. And then into 2020, he really had a good time.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the reason why, because there was a gap in the market for Daniel Rick safe space content where, Checkered Flag or Box of Neutrals or the official podcast. And it's interesting, in your episode, in the one before the chat before, which is by the magic of recording only minutes ago for us, but for you guys a week apart, you're talking about, Danny Rick was the character and Mark Webber wasn't as outgoing. Interestingly, in Beyond the Grid's first season where there was less advertising, Tom, I think Mark was like one of the first couple of episodes. And he said, I don't understand why drivers have as much connection with the audience now as they do, because I didn't like that. I liked having a bit of mystique.
Yep.
And I think Daniel's to a point similar in that, there is some mystique about Daniel, but when you see him, what you see is what you get.
Yep.
I mean, I know people who know him and he is who he is when he is around. There is no character. It's like Campy's like Campy. Sometimes
like
mid 2020, he kind of put on a little bit of character, but he is who he is. He is a very lovable, very funny, very engaging human being, much like you are as well. And great opinions and very well-formed sentences now for him.
Yeah.
And similarly, Freya is as well. She's incredibly intelligent, has great opinions and loves banter and loves a bit of a laugh. So I think, that previous generation with Mark has handed over to the DR generation, and all of us on this podcast are the same age as DR, give or take a year or two or three, but similar mindset. So I think it was one of those things where I was like, well, I think we can do this content better. And I know that there are people out there who want to hear more F1 podcasting that is more general. So we're Daniel Ricciardo biased, but if you want to listen to a podcast talking about Lance Stroll, then we still talk about him. Well, sometimes we'll call him a squid, but in the first couple of years, we were like, it's his 1 in 7 races that he's actually does very well.
Yep.
So I think that was one of the things that maybe want to start it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that is still unique that we will still talk about each of the drivers. Quite often you'll find that they just gloss over, right? And pick the headlines and talk about a couple of key points. And that's something that we do that's really unique. Can you recall your first F1 race that you went to?
Was the same one with you? I'd never been to a Formula One race before.
Yeah.
Because I didn't grow up in Melbourne. Coming down, I didn't have any real reason to come down here. I think my godparents or my godmother lived here, and that was it. So the only time before I moved to Melbourne in the end of 2014, the only time I'd been here prior to that was with work.
Yep.
To visit the advertising agency that supported the work that I was doing in Canberra at the time. So I didn't really know the Mornington Peninsula. And so I came down and drove around and was like gobsmacked by how beautiful it was.
Yeah.
But if you had said to me, like, where is the Oz Grand Prix circuit, I couldn't really tell you. I'd be like, well, Melbourne, but I don't exactly know where. So which sounds ridiculous. Like, yes, it's Albert Park, but as someone who spends very confusing time in Sydney trying to figure out where I am at the best times, and I grew up there, it sort of confuses you for the rest of the world. So yeah, I think that was the first one because I was here at Access, and I also didn't want to go by myself.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I didn't really mention before, but one of the things that I am a big fan of why I started the podcast, or why we started the podcast, was that by myself and my own friendship group, I loved Formula One. I had others who loved MotoGP. My best mate Alistair loves MotoGP. And when we were at the Defence Force Academy together, we would watch GP and F1, with each other. But he would obviously be more interested in that, and I would be more interested in the F1 side of things.
And you kind of just like went along with it to keep each other
company.
Because
I thought Jorge Lorenzo was a dickhead. And when he was celebrating in 11 and 12, I was like, he just looks like a dickhead. And I can't be bothered watching that sport anymore. And that's what happened. So now that he's gone, I think the sport is much better. Although now that the doctor's gone, I'm not sure how the sport's really going to survive.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting, the viewership is way down as a result. But yeah, that trying to build a community where me and someone else on a different friendship group could connect over Formula One was a vibe. It's like if you would go into a party and there's people there you don't know, and somehow you got talking to someone else about Formula One, suddenly you're like, I've got a new friend.
There's a party going on. Who cares? I'm talking about Formula One with my new mate.
Yeah. And this is pre-Drive to Survive. So the awareness factor was very, very slim.
And like, I think we can point to a few factors. It was hard to watch and access. You didn't have the exposure. There wasn't a lot to read about. There wasn't a lot to watch. You had to work hard to be an F1 fan early on before Drive to Survive. It was almost like uncool as well, would you say? Like, do you think
Absolutely.
Do you think that's changed? Do you think
The way that Formula One has been presented now, I don't think Formula One itself has changed in terms of the drama, the controversy, the safety, the fear factor. I just think the way the narrative is being presented to us is a lot easier to consume.
Yep.
So, to be honest, I'm not sure it would have worked at any other time in history, this Drive to Survive way.
Yeah, that's an interesting proposition.
Because the Netflix, Box to Box Films, which is a production company in the UK, they're very well connected into the Formula One paddock already. So I think they pitched to F1 and then Netflix. I think they asked F1 like, initially, would this be a good idea? Would you allow us to have access? And they were like, yep. And then pitched to Netflix, and that's how it got off the ground. I think if it wasn't for the combination of their access with the paddock and some of the reporters, so like Will Buxton and Jenny Gale, for example, are good friends with the people who run that production company, some of the drivers and the camera crew and the producers and everyone else who had already been around.
Yep.
If it was like a fresh team who had just come in, you wouldn't get, I don't think, in season one, I don't think you would get Daniel being as loose as he was.
Yep.
I don't think you would get the honesty and some of that raw passion and emotion as we did.
Yeah.
And so because it was that, but also the follow-up season launched literally just before COVID hit.
Yep.
And so I think in a lot of the feeds of Netflix around the world, then Drive to Survive was still there because they had a budget that's spent. They still need to get some return on that. So people had something else to binge.
Yeah.
And I think it's all this combination of factors together that has made this massive wave, bigger than they were ever expecting.
Yeah.
And I think scary to be in that business now to try and figure out how you have longevity in that space, because the answer is you don't.
Yeah.
So it's about sifting through people who weren't really going to be long-term fans. They enjoyed it for a little bit, and maybe they watch 5-minute highlights or watch the news or follow F1 on Instagram for the good driver content, but they're never going to follow through probably the way that we do, and a way that a lot of our fans and listeners will do now as a result of being introduced by Drive to Survive.
Yeah.
Maybe they were that with AFL or the EPL or NBA or whatever else, and they've just found that sort of, I get to watch this story of Daniel Ricciardo unfold before my eyes in dramatic sense.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting parallel because obviously we were interested in Formula One separate of Drive to Survive. It just we predated just. Luckily, we can say
I'm still going
that.
to take it.
We can claim that. But I think a parallel for me is like Welcome to Wrexham. I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
On Disney, but it's Rob McElhenney and Ryan Reynolds.
Ah, cool.
By a Welsh.
I bloody want to watch that.
You should. They buy a Welsh
the King
soccer
was
team.
there the other day.
Excellent. But so I am
It's the third oldest sports club in the world or something?
the oldest stadium, the oldest soccer stadium in the world.
Ah, that's so cool.
So it's really interesting because that I am the newcomer to like Drive to Survive.
Yes.
To the Wrexham Football Club in the history, and I only have the view of like what I've seen there. But I now have followed them on social media. I'm not watching every game. I'm not doing all those things, but I'm participating in this kind of arm's length, interested from an entertainment narrative point of view, but I'm not a Wrexham fan, say. So it's interesting because I think there is probably a lot of that community for Drive to Survive, which is I'm here for the storylines and what is happening in the next season and the next episodes, but I don't know if we've actually converted to Formula One fans or just Drive to Survive fans. How do you think the F1 community has taken the Drive to Survive newcomers? That's something I think like we've been mulling around. I know myself, the hipster that I probably am, and I'll admit to, like we both like.
There's some indoor plants here, so yeah.
But we were like, I have a record player. I like good music. We like excellent food, coffee, wine, things like that. We have more unique tastes that we would say from the mainstream. So newcomers are often seen as like jumping on a thing that, and I don't want to like it anymore. How do you think that the newcomers have been received, and how are they taken from the original F1 community?
Look, I love the newcomers because without the newcomers, we wouldn't have the investment and the ideas like sprint races and the want to try and make this sport a better sporting spectacle and more entertaining. I think to put yourself, if you've been a fan of the sport for longer than the Drive to Survive has been out, if you think that you're, as a result, better, a better fan than Drive to Survive, you can put yourself in the bin because that's the kind of crappy attitude I think that just, I think just destroys good communities. And I don't believe that we've got that in Lakeside Drive anyway. And I'm sure plenty of you listening or watching have friends who are like that with some sports, and maybe that's you. And if that is, I would just say that there is something to say about wanting to go back to V8s and V10s and go back to 17 or 16 or 12 races a year. But the reality is it's not going to happen. It's fine if you want to complain about Vegas, but no one's forcing you to watch it.
No.
And I think, that suits a demographic. We won't be able to afford to go to a lot of us regular fans. I think Tara and Freya was talking about this a couple of weeks ago on their episode, that it's not accessible for a reason. And I think it's very easy to forget that Formula One is a business as well. So, the shareholders want a return.
Yeah.
We want entertainment. The drivers want to be safe, but also want to enjoy themselves. There's a lot of silly decision making that still goes on track and sometimes behind the scenes. And I think there's a lot of, do as I say, not as I do in terms of belief with a lot of the missions that they've got. But yeah, I think the Drive to Survive fan base has energized this sport to a point where, we released a couple of weeks before it came out. And I think our podcast has sort of ridden a wave early on, maybe not necessarily now, but early on with a lot of our US listeners, because they saw Daniel Ricciardo as this legend and went, I want to go find some audio content that talks about him. And keyword search, good SEO, James.
Good work, James.
Daniel Ricciardo in the show description, and people started listening and going, oh yeah, cool, I get it. And because we didn't heavily lean into technical facts.
Yes.
Firstly, I don't know enough about that stuff. I am interested, I just don't know enough.
That's a campy thing.
And secondly, I don't think many of us are either. And
not to the constant, but
no
reading, just I don't know,
the technical regulations. Campy said the other day, or was it Campy or someone else?
Yeah,
if you want to know,
it's like, I'll just go read
the technical regulations.
Man.
No. That's your job. You do that.
Yes,
I'm not doing that for you. So I think it's changed the sport for the better because there is more attention now. You can go down the street And here's actually the biggest difference. So I have a beautiful blue heeler cross Kelpie called Kenny Rogers. He's a great rescue dog, and I will walk him down to the dog park or walk around the block, whatever else. And not every time, I would say probably out of a normal 7-day week, maybe 2 days a week, I see someone wearing a Danny Rick hat.
Yep.
Now, never before ever did I say if I'm seeing Red Bull merch, it's V8 Supercars.
Yes.
It's not, it's Red Bull Ampol. It's not, or Caltex. It's not Red Bull Racing from a Formula 1 point of view. So it's interesting that I'm starting to see more of that now, like the merch you've got on.
Yep.
DR's own line, McLaren or Red Bull hats or Renault hats. I was on a tram the other day and someone down the far end was wearing a Danny Rick Renault hat and someone closer to me was wearing a McLaren hat.
Yeah.
And I was like, it's just a shift, I think. And
and
if that's what Drive to Survive has done, then I genuinely welcome it, because it not only is it great for the sport, but it's creating more opportunities, it's creating more jobs, it's creating space for us as a podcast, for example, to grow into wanting to be relevant and for people wanting to put their money where their mouth is to support us to do cool content.
For sure. And I think we were all newcomers at some point to the sport. And I think what we should do is welcome the community that is incoming, and hopefully this podcast is a way that people can engage and be brought along for the journey and care more about it than just watching an episodic kind of documentary series.
Yeah, that's right.
And they can find another layer of like, oh, there's a stickiness here that I want to know more than just the glossy kind of narrative documentary drama kind of type thing. But I want to dive deeper into the what actually happened, or I want to see live what's happening, because that's back to that Wrexham thing. Is like, I'm like, how are they doing this year? Are they going to get promoted? Like, I'm invested now. And I think that's what's happened is maybe initially it was very just entertainment and interesting to watch, but now people are like, but where's Danny Rick?
Yeah.
What's happening? And I think it's going to be really interesting to see in this upcoming season what's happening, and kind of how they navigate that, and what future seasons will look like now. Is Daniel going to take over and run the whole thing this year?
We just don't know what kind of opportunities are ahead of him.
Yep.
And I think it's for me as well, looking at the bigger picture of what this podcast is and where everyone else sits. I mean, we're part of a bigger picture. I know we started to meet a certain market, and at least in my mind, in my marketing mind, that's where I thought we would go. But it's a lot bigger than that now, which is terrifyingly amazing in so many ways. And one of the things that I still don't like is you listen to podcasts, and I'm talking like the top 5 downloaded Formula 1 podcasts, and there's no relationship between the presenters. There's no, I don't feel like there's passion. Like, it's clearly a paid podcast, and that's fine. And maybe they're journalists, and some written journalists are terrible at speaking. That's why they're not radio presenters. Yeah. And so when they're put in a position of presenting a podcast, it's very hard to listen to.
Yes.
It's very, very dry. They might be brilliant and they might know everything, but there's no spark.
Yeah.
Right. So with us, it's one of the things I love doing in person is, and getting into our space with Zeke and being in person. That really towards the latter half of this year was very energizing, because we get the banter back, we get the flow back. And I think one of the things that I really love doing, and hopefully when we really love an episode, you as the listener can feel that, because our energy is up, the way that we talk is different. The flow is a lot better. I have to do less editing, and that's everyone is happy about that.
Yes.
So I'm a big fan of, as a trio, what we've got going on. But I'm also a big fan of when Freya steps in. In person when she's here to be able to do some stuff. Of course, I think we reviewed one of the Grand Prix here.
That was fun, wasn't it?
It was great. No, legitimately great.
And we had to keep Freya at distance because she was flying in and had to fly out soon. We're like,
back when COVID
like,
testing
stay
was
over
a thing.
there, don't get near us. It was,
But it was still great. And I think also
Totally.
when we do stuff, because we've done that with her in person, then obviously the remote stuff is a lot easier.
Yeah.
As much as we would all prefer her to be in person.
Yeah.
But the relationship thing, I think, and we spoke about it on your episode with Top Gear. Top Gear was a big thing for me too. Adfa sucked. Like it was really up and down for me.
Yep.
I sought often solace in Top Gear.
Yep.
So I remember my hard drive, and I had all of the seasons of Top Gear, and obviously they were still being added at that point. And I would just get to the end and then start at the beginning again.
Same.
And I think it was that realization that, and you talk to people who aren't car people who would watch it because it's a relationship. It
transcended, didn't it?
It's an entertainment show more so than it was a car show. And so I think when you came along in that third episode of Oz F1 and I realized how good it was, the vibe that the three of us had, I was like, okay, this is actually something special here, which then takes us to a next level. So we're already doing something where we're talking about every driver on the grid.
Mm-hmm.
We're also reaching the Danny Rick fan base. And because we're riding this wave of Drive to Survive, because we'd already had a couple episodes out by the time it was released, that it meant that people had somewhere to go.
Yeah.
But not only somewhere to go, but to join us at the ground floor of the journey.
Yep.
Like that's a big thing. When you start with someone, and I know plenty of you who've been listening have listened from the very beginning.
Sorry for your loss.
I'm sorry for your loss as well. I don't know how you've done it, and hats off to you. But you've seen how much we've grown. If you're brand new here, I mean, probably don't, but you can go all the way back to the very beginning to hear how we've changed. But the relationship, I think, you listen to it and it's a development of the relationship between the three of us.
Yeah.
And I love it. Like, I genuinely love it. When we have a good episode, I'm buzzing for hours afterwards.
Yeah, it is. It's really exciting. And I think that's exciting. So you quickly mentioned your time at Defence. So that was straight after school into Defence?
No.
What did you do before Defence?
I did not want to go to university at all. I had zero interest.
Yep.
And I wanted to join the Air Force as a logistics officer, but I didn't want to go to university. I had maths, I had science, I had all of that. Like,
how are you gonna be in
logistics
Force,
officer, not a pilot. Like, I'm happy to,
still.
this many blankets and stack boxes. But I took a year off, graduated school in 2007, took a year off, and then I. At some point during the year, I can't really remember what happened, but I think some friends of mine were from school had gone to ADFA, and I think I'd gone down for something to Canberra to hang out. And look, it seemed good enough. Anyway, went through the entry process, wanted to do Air Force stuff, Defence Force recruiting, who I later worked for, said, oh no, but look, join the Army as a general service officer and you can transfer later. That's a lie. If you listen... and you're trying to join the Defence Force and they say, oh, don't worry about it. They're all trying to meet quotas and targets. So I joined the Defence Force and joined Army, tried to transfer, and that was not really a thing. And it's an option. It is certainly an option, but it's not as easy as they made it out to be. So anyway, I did a couple of years of that, and in my full, very coordinated state in my third year, I fell in a wombat hole.
Oh.
On an exercise and buggered my ankle. So I was shortly thereafter departed the Defence Force and medically discharged, which suits me fine.
So it sounds like a few things happened at your time there. Your love for Canberra. And
I do love Canberra.
And your continued love for Air Force. That was something. I remember being at the Grand Prix with you.
Oh, yeah.
And you commenting on flyovers and exactly what this person was doing. And it sounds like you managed to enter that space and had some kind of knowledge beyond just loving aircraft.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was Royal Air Force and flew some really cool planes like the Hawker Hunter and the Vulcan, which is this massive-ass V-bomber at Cold War era. And that sort of really dictated a lot of why I love, we talk about the fly pass, for example, is I absolutely knew that. After I left Army, I worked for a little bit at Defence Force recruiting. As I said, one of those roles was Air Force marketing for a little bit. So I played with some planes and got to shoot them with, and that was interesting because that was the first time I had proper access to like creative people. Yeah. So like a director of production and a crew, and here's a storyboard and here's what we're doing for the advert. So we shot Women in Air Force advert. I shot the Army diversity campaign and a few other reserve campaigns and stuff. Some of my stuff's still floating around the place, which is really cool.
That's cool.
Some of the radio ads as well. But it was interesting because I suddenly went, oh, that's really bloody cool. And so I kind of got the job because being an advert, it doesn't really matter what service you are. You just consume knowledge about everyone.
But I vividly remember like you talking about how far away the person in the aircraft was to time the flyover, and that's something you're very
time
critical.
on target. I am
time on target. Is that something that you learned in those marketing days? And for those ads and things you were filming?
Yeah, well, it was in army time, so you talk
Yeah.
about like time on target for a whole range of things. And it's not necessarily always the pilot's. Well, it's not the pilot's fault because he or she are waiting for information from the ground.
Yep.
So I remember when we were standing there was a dude in cams just off, like, it was
Yes,
about
and you pointed
60 meters away
pointed
with a
out,
big
yeah.
ass radio. So he's also generally a pilot or she, and they will be like, all right, national anthem is about to start. And the
Yep.
national anthem is generally a set period of time.
Yep.
And so you're supposed to have like end of national anthem, like high note, and then
boom,
fly
yeah,
over,
time
you know,
to perfection,
fireworks, whatever.
Yeah, that's what we want.
Slightly easy to do with helicopters because you can kind of get them to hover and then go.
Yep,
Fighter jet's a little harder to do.
bit of a runner.
But when you get it on point, that's when you get a 10 out of 10 from James for a flyover.
Yeah, and you
time on target, boof.
Have you ever dived into the flying or learning to fly of any aircraft?
Yep. I have flown both powered and glider. And I love flying gliders. It scares the living shit out of me every time I get towed up because it is a terrifying thought that, I mean, the capsule is, you know, there's nothing in front of you.
Yeah.
In a powered aircraft, there's a bit of distance and then a propeller generally. Or
Yeah, it's
engines.
just you.
It's just you and a thin frame. So it teaches an amazing sense of calm and control and aerodynamics, what's actually happening, learning physics the physical way. I always remember, you know, people would talk about glide slope and would try and work it out. They'd be like, oh, I'm here at here, and so that means that I've got a glide slope of this.
Yeah.
I would use the TLAR approach, which is that looks about right. Just punch it in, and if I need to adjust, then I'll adjust.
I'll fix it.
And which is how my brain works. So
I'll do it on the day.
That's right. So I love it. So my first flight actually was a Goodwood, which is
no way.
Yeah. So I think I was 14. Yeah, it must have been 14. Did a powered flight there. And Dad made this big thing of it because, of course, he was a pilot. So both my parents being from the UK was a big thing, and Goodwood is kind of the part of the world where they're from. And yeah, it was starting to not only do that, but to be where the Rolls-Royce factory was.
Yeah, wow.
Obviously Festival Speed and Revival and everything else. So yeah, first flight there in a Piper PA-28. Was it Tomahawk anyway? One of those two aircraft for Goodwood, and did a little bit of flying here. It's very expensive.
Yes.
Did some flying out of Tyab when I moved down initially.
Yeah.
And the peninsula is beautiful from the air.
Yeah.
But I think I realized that it wasn't going to be a career for me.
Yes.
And so, and Cammy's spoken about this as well. Like, it's cool to do and it's very engaging and a great hobby, but you got to have a lot of cash and you got to have time.
Oh yeah.
And I don't really have either of those things. So it's fun to do. And at some point in the future, I'd love to get my private pilot's license.
Yep.
But you know, commercial aircraft exist for a reason.
Yeah.
And then I'll hopefully get rich enough to fly private. Now it's never going to happen.
That'd be nice.
I'm always just going to go commercial.
When you were flying over the peninsula, is that when you were noticing all of the lovely wineries and the surrounds?
Yeah. So I left, I chased my now wife down to the peninsula, and I was living in Brisbane at the time. So I'd moved from Canberra to Brisbane.
In case you're wondering, James has lived in a lot of places.
I do love a good move. I don't love it. I just detest it rather immensely, but I am very good at moving.
You'd want to be.
Yeah, for the amount of times I've done it. But yeah, I'd left Brisbane. I left a full-time job there to come down to Mornington. And after Army, like, I did a Bachelor of Arts in History and Politics. So that's not applicable for anything, for any kind of work.
It's made up.
It is made up.
As
Bachelor
my
of Arts.
housemate now knows, who's just finished her arts degree. It's useless.
Have you finished your arts degree, Kiara? Sorry for your loss. No worries. Enjoy. So this is one of the good things about ADFA is you don't have a HECS debt. Now Kiara's got a HECS debt and nothing to show for it. But that is an interesting. It was an interesting time because I left. I was like, I don't know what to do, and I had a friend who worked at DFR, so that's how I got that job. I think I did work experience a little bit. So I'd left Army, was doing work experiencing there, and I actually was working at a paintball field.
Wow.
So I was managing a
learning.
paintball field on the weekends.
Yep.
So, and I loved that. I mean, and I got to a point where because if you ever fight a paintball gun, it sucks. Like, there's no real good way of judging it. But I finally figured out like the gun that I would constantly use and like the arc of where the paint would go. And I'd stopped wearing suits. Like I'd obviously you have to wear safety gear and stuff, but it was like hot Canberra summer. So I'd stop wearing the full suits. I'd wear a t-shirt and whatever and pants and boots. But like if anyone thinks about shooting me, like I'll find you and I'll just annihilate your mask because I like welts are one thing, but tasting paint, that is disgusting. And I would find, and some people try, like there would maybe be one dickhead at like a Bucks party.
If you said that, that's probably egging a few people on.
Yeah, and then it's like, hey man, why don't you go stand 30 meters over there and the rest of us will stand here and we'll fire at you. Don't be a dickhead. But I did that. So I would work 7 days a week for a while and then finally got offered a job at DFR. And I was very grateful for that. Still did paintball for a little bit because I really enjoyed it and stopped because it was becoming too much. But it was a interesting time because a lot of people who were around me were like, had marketing degrees or had advertising degrees. And one of the things that I've realized, and there are some people who disagree with me on this and some journalists as well, is that I don't actually think you need a degree in anything that you actually want to do. It is about perseverance, determination, and networking.
Yep.
You know, there is no such thing as good luck. It's all prior preparation and perfect timing.
Yeah. Honestly, James is one day going to be brilliant and have to write a biography. And it's going to be called,
going to write it for me.
I was a bottle and a half wine deep and I DM'd someone and this happened, because that is happened
twice now.
many times across this journey and it's netted great results, it would seem. So I think that is one piece of advice I've taken from you is just ask, figure out the most, I don't know, important person's email or DM you can find and just ask, just get in.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people just feel like there's a barrier.
Yeah.
And you're a very confident person and you've just managed to navigate that into opportunity.
Bullshit baffles brains. and that's never been truer in this instance. And look, I mean, I had done a bit of community radio in that year I took off between school and joining the Defence Force, did some community radio, but that was really the only presenting experience I had in this space.
Yep.
I've done singing, I've done musical theatre and acting and stuff. So yes, when you hear my voice in other people's microphones, unfortunately I can't switch off my projection. It just will not do. I've tried. It will not happen in my brain. But all of these things sort of combining together and a love of a sport that I've watched on and off pretty much for my entire life has landed this podcast, I think, in a really good position.
Yeah, and I think like a love of the mechanical and all these things really have tied together.
And I edit. Zeke has edited a couple of things for us this year, but I personally edit everything that happens. You've done some video as well in the past, which has been great. And sometimes, that's the lie. You have edited 1 or 2 episodes.
Yeah,
but
it wasn't great.
But it's fine.
Yeah.
And it was, I think it was in-person stuff. And one of the things that I, and hopefully, look, if I do write a biography or maybe next year you guys know I've gone overseas a lot. I've chased a lot this year, a lot of work for next year.
Yeah.
I'd love to tell you the stakes, my iron, my fire, or rather, is where they are.
Yeah.
I have heaps of them. I have heaps of potentials. And I've got some really great contacts. And one of the things I would get to a position, I'd get to a meeting, and I'd be sitting there in this meeting room thinking, I started this podcast in my front room in Frankston.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in this office. I can't actually believe it. Well, hopefully I'll be able to tell you
that's something I wanted to touch on. So I'm hoping we can get into it, but you've been presenting the Extreme E podcast.
Yes.
Which is incredible. And we've talked about it a few times, and Campy and I try and talk about it as much as we can to help promote you doing great things.
I appreciate that.
You reluctantly try to keep it on the download, but that's pretty incredible. So you reached out to Extreme E and you've worked with Lam, and you've both been doing an incredible job, and you've brought Freya in as well.
Yeah.
And you managed to get over to London to go to one of the races. Can you talk a bit about the Extreme E experience, meeting some people? It sounds like you've made some incredible contacts. I love the people. I love the sport. Yeah.
Talking about getting in on the ground level, that was what happened. So, yes, I remember watching the first round of Extreme E, which was last year, 2021. Yep. And the only reason I knew about it is because back then, not anymore, but I followed Zach Brown on Instagram. And he and the Andretti team went in together with Andretti United to put a team together.
Yep.
And Timmy Hansen and Katie Munnings were the drivers. And anyway, so I was like, okay, cool. Well, I'll watch it. Motorsport on the weekend, they didn't have motorsport on.
Yep.
The racing was okay. There was a lot of dust, and
it was so dusty that first one, wasn't it?
And I guess, first time out, first event, who knows what's going to bloody happen. So fair enough. But I went, all right, well, that's fine. But I sort of became a little bit more invested because they had Seb Loeb, Carlos Sainz Sr.
Some incredible people.
Lewis Hamilton had a team. Nico Rosberg had a team. Jensen Button had a team. Jensen Button was driving back then. And the whole thing was that we want to change the narrative of sport, motorsport specifically. It's very skewed heavily towards the male-dominated environment, which we want to undo. So we're creating teams where there are male and female drivers. And what that did was open up opportunities for a lot of these female drivers who are they're bloody fast, like ridiculously quick, B, incredibly lovely, to be able to get into the world stage. Molly Taylor is an example. And anyway, so I watched that and I'd had 6 beers. I'd had a whole 6-pack by myself and it was like, I don't know, like midnight or something. And I went to go, right, well, when's the next race? Oh, it's like bloody 2 months away. Oh, well, I'll go consume some podcast content because, I do a podcast and back then I
want to hear more, I want to learn more.
So I went looking, didn't exist. So I went onto the Extreme E website, found the email address that I could find, which I think was media@Extreme E, and drunkenly sent an email along the lines of, Extreme E needs a podcast and I'll do it for you. Basically,
I love it.
I think that was the headline, like the subject, and then in the thing it was, like, this is what I do. This is everything that happens, and this is why Formula One does it so well. I think Extreme E would do it quite well too.
This is an opportunity.
And I was listening to Beyond the Grid a lot, and I thought, it's good, but I would do things slightly differently and slightly more relaxed. And so, anyway, I had an email back from them, and they were like, "Yeah, okay, send us a pitch." I was like, "Oh."
Whoops, that worked.
And so prior to that email coming back, the week before, I was living in Sydney. The week before, I had interviewed with you, Michael Laminato and Michael Italiano
in the same night.
In the same evening.
Yeah.
Obviously, Italiano was in the UK and Lamo came down in person, which is great. Absolute legend. And I thought back then, well, I need some legitimacy to this podcast proposal here. Mm-hmm. Lamo had been doing Boxing Neutrals. He'd done ABC Grandstand with Boxing Neutrals for a while.
Yep.
F1 Strategy Report. He was doing at that point, the Oz Grand Prix podcast came out of COVID. So that was shortly after I came down. But I said, hey, man, do you want to jump on? Because I remember one of the questions that I think you asked him was like, would you ever say no to anything? He's like, no, I'd say yes to every opportunity I get podcast-wise. So I was like, well, I've got his number now.
Aha!
I will send him, or at least email address, I will send him an email and say, hey, man, I've got this thing. Do you want to have a chat? So he replied. He said, yes, we had a chat. Sent through a proposal, hooked up a Zoom meeting with the UK guys, and I went to sort of start saying, so this is why I think I need a podcast. Anyway, Ali Russell, the chief marketing officer, was like, James, hang on, stop. And I was like, oh, shit.
Damn it.
What have I done? What have I said already? I don't know. I've already decided I want to do it. How much is it going to cost? I mean, I don't know. It's my first day. I hadn't thought that far ahead. So I was like, I don't know, Ali. We'll get back to you on a pricing and we'll set it out anyway. And we got put into the digital team, or under the digital team, in Tierney Oliver, who is now, I can say, a friend, who was digital manager of Extreme E back then. Absolute awesome dude and very, very talented in that space. Michael and I sort of helped set it up, and the first interview we did was with Molly Taylor.
Yep.
And she lives down here in Melbourne. So
perfect.
I hopped on a plane and Lamo got in a car and we kind of met down Bayside Way and we interviewed her in her front room.
Yep.
And then she shortly flew out to the second race. And look, Extreme E is one of those things. The racing now is phenomenal. It took a long time to get there. But I was very proud to have gone from Lakeside Drive, front room, Frankston, to official motorsport podcast.
Yep.
And I'm sitting with, like just thinking about like hanging out with people who would post something on their Instagram.
Yep.
And their verified account and they've got 150,000 followers.
Yep.
To me that just kind of mind-blowing.
Who were the pinch me kind of people you got to talk to or interview?
Just everyone.
Yeah.
Like ridiculous. So we would go to, so one of the things that happens, Michael and I traveled for the last race of last year, which was in December. In fact, this time last year.
Yeah.
What is the date? It legitimately
Right
today
now.
last year.
That's right. Yeah, because I remember you came in just before Christmas when you came home.
Yeah.
Yep.
Came back on Christmas Eve and spent Christmas Day in a COVID testing line that took me 4.5 hours. I was not in a good mood. And yeah, we went over, and of course, COVID was a big thing back then. A lot of the digital team and the social team had COVID, so they weren't there. So we were asked to do some of their TikTok live stuff and their Instagram live stuff, and we did. So in that, spoke to Nico Rosberg, Jensen Button, or interviewed rather, Christina Gutierrez, a whole bunch of other people. And it was funny because obviously we're there to do podcasting. And what I found really interesting is like we were standing on the sort of viewing platform where the command center was, which is next to the start and finish line, or next to the switch zones. And we were recording the opening for it to camera, and had a couple of the team PRs standing off to one side who we'd kind of spoken to a little bit and gone, his introduction, blah, 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 whatever. And anyway, did it. And so, of course, the camera goes live, and I'm like, "G'day, guys! We're here at the South Coast of the United Kingdom. Blah 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 blah.
Just
Michael does amazing
James
stuff.
Yeah.
We do amazing stuff, and then cut." And I remember Tina was like, "Holy shit, that was!" And the PR's like, "Did you just do that in one take?" Like, yeah,
mate.
And it kind of blew their minds. It kind of blew my mind a little bit too, because Lam and I had only done in person. We'd done our interview on Lakeside Drive and Molly's interview. The rest of it had been remote.
All remote, yeah.
And then the first bit of content we do when we get there,
last race of the season,
is last race of the season to camera work.
Yeah.
And we're having to chat to some of these drivers in person. Yeah. And it just didn't phase any of us.
Yeah.
We were like, all right, let's just do it. So I think it was like his level of professionalism and probably my excitement, but I would say natural ability to, I mean, I'm
definitely
very outgoing and whatever else, but my natural ability to think about the story arc of something and then do it. So, for example, I don't really prepare a lot for interviews. I like feeling it.
Yep.
Freya, for example, or Michael, for example, loves notes. And I think one way or the other isn't necessarily the best way of going about it, but combining it, you get into a really good rhythm. And it's one of the reasons why I think it works so well for the Extreme E. So it was fun to do that in person, but just to be like go to the catering tent and sit down, and you'd have like, I remember at one point I was sitting with some of the crew. I was sitting with some of the Extreme E crew, and then behind me was Seb Loeb and the X44 team, and I could see diagonally over from me was like Carlos Sainz Sr. having lunch. Molly walks past like, "G'day mate, how you going? Yeah, good. How are you?" Sarah Price, who we'd interviewed as well, and Katie Munnings. And that's the other thing, like we turned up and we'd interviewed a couple of the drivers already remotely. Yeah. And we get in person, they're like, "Oh, g'day James, how's it going?" Well, not g'day, we're like the equivalent where they came from. Ola or whatever else. And so I did that, and I remember, I interviewed Christine GZ in person. We both did. And then 2 months later I'm in Andorra with her. Yeah. She's doing ice driving and I'm hanging out, not really sure what I'm doing there.
Yeah, that was like a spur of the moment invitation. "Hey James, you want to come hang out?" Okay.
Yeah.
Where am I going?
I'd realized that at the end of last year, I was working a corporate job again. I just could not deal with people and an incompetent public service chain of command. And I wanted to do this properly. And I kind of already knew that, but I needed, I think, to go back to real world
one last time
just to remind myself. And so I was all in at that point in December. I was like, no, I'm going to do this for real.
Yeah.
So I networked heavily whilst I was there. And one of the things that I said is that I would say yes to any opportunity, a motorsport opportunity that I had in 2022.
Yep.
And GZ was the first. She messaged me and she's like, "Hey, like I'm doing some ice driving. Do you want to come?"
Yeah.
I was like, "When?" "Next weekend." Like this coming weekend, I think. Next weekend. It was a Friday. She messaged me and I think I said yes on the Sunday, flew out on the Monday. No, flew out on the Wednesday. Flew out on the Tuesday, arrived Wednesday night in Barcelona, got out to Andorra. It's like 10 p.m., walk into the restaurant they're all there at. And here's Australian mind James, they're like, I'm like, oh, they would have finished dinner, everything else. No, incorrect, of course, because they're Spanish.
Yep.
Just starting.
Yes.
So I then burled on for a couple more hours and met some incredible people. And it's I think that was a great starting point for my year of, I've done many trips to the UK this year and to overseas.
How many flights are you up to? 37?
37 flights
Yeah.
for this year. That's it now. There's no more. I don't have that many weeks left, but 37 flights. The majority of them long haul and the majority of them in business class because on Qantas points and reward seats, I've managed to figure that out. So if anyone wants any advice on how to fly business class, I mean, it's easy by yourself. Starting to get family and everyone else involved is difficult to find reward seats, but to do that. And so it was a massive pinch me moment because not only am I traveling to try and chase work, I'm very supported at home and to do that. And I'm flying business class to get there. This year just hasn't felt real. Yeah. And the meetings that I've had and the people I've spoken to, and even like getting to McLaren, so the MTC, and I'm sitting there, that was like how am I here?
Yeah. Insane. And my favorite anecdote that you've had is when interviewing Tanner and walking through the main lobby and the maniac is just touching everything. Things that you're not allowed to touch. Like, well, if he is, I'm going to touch stuff.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is watching Top Gear.
Yep.
You love it, right? We always kind of thought US Top Gear was like, it's a bit average.
I kind of like pushed through and enjoyed it, to be honest.
But that was in early days.
Yes.
The lineup changed, and the last lineup that they had, including Tanner, I remember watching, I think, all of the seasons.
Mm.
And so not only am I sitting in the McLaren Technology Center, and it was that trip I was trying to figure out season 2 of the podcast. We weren't really sure whether or not it was going to happen.
Yep.
So I kind of did it just in case it did. So there was also an opportunity, a potential rather, that both the interviews with Emma Gilmore and Tanner Faust would never have hit anything.
Yeah.
But whatever, you get paid to do it. So I went and did it. Not that I would have done it for free, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah.
Don't tell them that. But it was interesting going to, like, you get the call and then I had to hire gear. So I had to hire a roadcaster over there and microphones and all that kind of stuff and be like, I've got to figure it out.
Professional. Yeah,
I need to look professional, right? And getting on the train and heading down there and it was surreal because it was the first time that I had interviewed anyone by myself.
Yep.
Not only just remotely, but like then in person, had that element on it as well. Yeah. So I couldn't just like refer to notes. I wanted to be engaged with these people, and it was at the MTC. So I arrived and it's a maze of a place. Really,
pretty epic building. So drive up on, right? Yeah,
phenomenal. And I've had the pleasure of going in the front and the back entrance. The first time was the back entrance. The second time was the front entrance, which was stunning to drive around that lake. But it was, a pretty like pinch me moment because that was like, here's Daniel's car.
Yeah.
Touch it. Here's Senna's car. Touch it. Here's Häkkinen's car, Raikkonen's car, touch it. Prost's car, touching Berger's car, touching all of these things.
Yeah.
Hamilton, Button, Alonso's cars in a row, like the Vodafone livery ones.
Yeah.
And mind blowing. And then, we did the interviews first, and Emma and I, because Emma's from New Zealand, and in Extreme E, she was driving for Veloce last year as a backup driver, reserve driver when Jamie Chadwick was out driving W Series. So she did 2 events last year, and we sort of started to connect a little bit over it because she would listen to the podcast, and then she connected with me on Instagram, messaged like, "Hey, it's really good." And here's Emma, who incredibly fast driver, but owns a Suzuki dealership in Dunedin, is a small business owner.
Yeah,
hustles hard. Drives when she can because she loves it, but has a real job. And then she gets announced to be, McLaren's first female driver, and it just. I think that for me is probably my favorite moment this year of that announcement, or the end of last year, the announcement and how everything came about, because first female drive for McLaren, but also to be a Kiwi as well, and a Kiwi originating team, I think is a bit mind blowing. And she's had some great success this year as well, which has been great. They've been announced for next year as well as a pairing. But to sit with Tanner, and this is the thing, and I don't like blowing my own trumpet, but to sit with him at the end of the interview was like, Dude, that was like the best interview that I've had in a very long time. I've been doing this shit a long time.
Someone who's been exposed to a lot of media and is in media himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who is professionally trained.
Yeah.
He's like, I loved how you hit all these great questions, but you kept it relaxed and everything else.
Yeah.
And it's a style that I wanted to always do, but I never thought I could actually do it.
Confirmation of it being working and being awesome is great, right?
I sat there many times through that chat going, what am I doing? How do I do this? How do I ask this question? Where do I take this thing? But I think after I got out of my own head and sort of let it flow, it was great. So yeah, and we took a selfie on the promenade looking down to the boulevard, and he was like, can I take you for lunch? And bearing in mind, this is the day before the entire McLaren team livery launch, right?
Like, you're pretty busy, right?
He's like, no, I think Emma and I have got free afternoon. Have we got free schedule now? She's like, yeah, let's go for lunch. Great. So Emma's like, oh, I'll drive you into town. No worries. So we head into Woking. And so I've done like, and again, I can't tell you how hilarious it is. And everyone I've spoken to, Extreme E, knows the story about me being drunk and sending the email. But to go from Lakeside Drive, Frankston front room, I mean, they don't understand the Frankston reference, but anyone it's like
humble.
It's not a flashy suburb. Yeah. And from there to sitting with Tanner Faust, who I watched on Top Gear, who then, and I think if you've listened to the interview, I'll be like, oh, what's one of the things? He's like, oh, I did Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift. Like all of that car is me. And like the garage scene, they wanted to do CGI. But I was like, no, I reckon we can do it in person. So that 350Z coming up the thing, that's him driving it.
Yeah.
And in that moment when he told me that, I was like, oh,
it's amazing.
I love that. It's so good. And so I just had to like calm myself a little bit. It's like,
keep it in.
Just relax.
Keep a lid on it, Jim.
Be pro. But it was, it's interesting. So that's been a great opportunity. And I think what it's done though is when we get access to people like Oscar and Daniel and VB and and which the 3 Australian drivers and then everyone else.
Yes.
I actually now have a better sense of just being true to myself, because I see a lot of journalists, they try very hard, they write all the questions out and they get deep into the data and the information. But the thing is, the person, you watching this on the other side of this lens or listening to this on the other side of this microphone, you and I are the same. I want content in the same way that you want it. Probably the reason why you either listening and have been listening for a long time or listening because you're brand new and maybe you've made it this far into this hour-long podcast already, is that the way that I put content together is the way that I know my listeners want.
Yep.
Because I am you.
Yes.
And, and I don't ever, it's not for clickbait. It's not for headline, because we don't report rather to anyone. We're allowed to do that. So hopefully it gets to a point where Lakeside Drive has full media access and I get to go into one of those press conferences and take notes and do everything else. But I personally would love to ask questions that it's not just about like, hey, Daniel, where are you driving next year?
Yep.
Something a little bit sort of left of center.
I think the prism of being a listener is an excellent way to view it. And I think that's something that we've all done is like, what would I want to listen to? What do I want from a podcast? And that's such a good way to do it, rather than, I feel like sometimes the journalists come in with an agenda or a question that they have an answer for and they just want confirmation of something they've already written.
Yeah.
Cool. Can I continue? Yeah, I've already written
That's
it.
Can a good
you
point.
Just confirm what I've said so I can add a quote next to it?
And they're getting paid, so their editor or whoever else wants them to do that.
Yes.
But we're not that.
No, and I think we're trying to find the human side of things, less so the more, I don't know, corporate thing. I would rather find a layer and something interesting. That 350Z anecdote is incredible and something that you wouldn't have got if you were just doing a formulaic interview about Extreme E and off-road driving.
That's right.
You wouldn't have got to that space. I think those like detours and things are a very interesting way of getting to know. And I think people who have listened to that interview will be like, I feel like I know Tanner Faust now. He's much different than I would have assumed or from just listening to other things or watching him on Top Gear. It's humanized and given another aspect to his personality.
One of the things that I want to achieve for the listener is I wanted to feel like we're at a bar or a pub, and obviously you can't take part in the conversation because you're listening or you're watching, but I'd love for you to feel like you're at the table over or the booth next to us So if Tommy T and I are having a drink somewhere in some bar in South Melbourne, I'd love for you to feel like you're at the booth over, listening to the ridiculousness of the banter or the conversation that we're having, so that you feel part of it. Because podcasts, like, I am hyper aware all the time that this is one of the most intimate versions of communicating with people.
Yep.
If you've listened to this podcast for years, you will feel like you are friends with us.
Yeah.
And that's bloody mind-blowingly fantastic, and we love and appreciate all of you. We genuinely do, because I feel that way when I listen to other podcasts.
Yep.
It is just the way that things happen. I speak to other podcasters and they feel the same when they meet some of their listeners or engage with them. And I take that really seriously, because I don't want to be untrue to us, because I know who you are, I know who Campy is, you know, and obviously we don't necessarily want you guys to know everything about us.
We can protect Campy from himself.
Mainly from him. But the what you get from us from a Lakeside Drive point of view is legit. If you were sitting next to me on the couch, next to Tommy on the couch there, or if like you're Kiara in the room, you have absolutely no interest in Formula One whatsoever, then you get to feel like you're part of a conversation, part of a chat. And I think coming in with that mindset for all of my interviews is really interesting and important, because no one else does it like that, because they're answering to someone else. And I'm lucky enough in that Extreme E, it's the series. So I'm not doing it for like Dirtfish or some other publication.
Yep.
I'm doing it for the series. The series know that that's how I do it, because that's how I pitched it.
Yeah.
And they were like, yes, that's what we want.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's why it works. And that's why I really enjoy it. And I think, again, like we were saying before, if I enjoy it and the guest enjoys it, then the listener's going to enjoy it too, because it's just a natural occurrence.
It flows on. Yeah, that's really interesting. We are going a long time, but that is great. I'm going to finish up with, what are you excited for this next season? It doesn't have to necessarily be podcast related, but what are you excited for in this upcoming Formula One season? What's coming down the pike?
I think for 2023, I think for the podcasting sense and for the season sense, for me at the moment in December, they're a little bit intertwined. I can't really see one differently from the other.
Yeah.
I think we've had a lot of change and interpretation of what listeners and viewers want, what we want as well. I think we've finally reached a point where other people will start recognizing how we operate and why we operate, and probably identify that it's different from a lot of other podcasts out there.
Yep. I
would expect that, considering the amount of work that I've done this year in flights and meetings and hustling, I got told at a point this year that I am in the UK known in the motorsport world as the hardest hustling motorsport podcaster.
That's really nice
there
to hear, hey?
So it's nice that other people have heard of what I'm doing, because I love, and because I'm not a journalist. And I would say this, I'm not a journalist, you know, I'm an extension of a fan. You know, I'm an avatar of the listener.
The People's Pundit, but sorry.
People's Pundit, yes. Although that podcast is not active anymore. But we'll see if I need to do my own, then that's potentially a thing. So, but I think for 2023, I think for us, it's going to be better. With Daniel not in a race seat, I think we're sort of emotionally removed a little bit from how hard it's been for him and for us to watch.
Tough season.
So coming in with a fresh lens, a little bit of a better direction for Lakeside Drive. Again, I mean, we're hinting all of these big things. You'll really want to tell you.
We'll tell you when it's time.
But I'm excited because I think we've all worked hard to that.
Yep.
And you know, I spend a lot of time editing, so it's nice to have people in industry say you've got one of the best sounding podcasts out there. It's not just F1, just out there,
just in general. Yeah.
Which is awesome, because I think that shows that we've really reached a really good point. So 2023 is going to be exciting because we've got Oscar Piastri coming in.
Yep.
We get the next generation of Australian fans as well. Potentially we get to do some cool stuff.
Yep.
We're all in Melbourne for a full season.
Stop moving around. Every state and city.
So I think there'll be more content for Lakeside Drive. Extreme E will still be great. There's potentially some other stuff that I'm working on personally outside of both of those things that I maybe get to share. Maybe not this coming year, but maybe next year, depending on when things actually eventuate. But yeah, I'm excited to continue this journey.
Yeah.
With a lot of you guys who have been listening from the beginning, and for you if you've just started listening, because there's a lot of content out there, a lot of video out there, a lot of podcasts out there, a lot of social media accounts. But I think we're onto a winner. You know, we're genuine to ourselves. We're authentic to each other. We get caught up on each other if we're not that. So I think it's going to be a really interesting and exciting year in 2023.
It is, definitely. Awesome. It's been good to learn a bit more about James. He doesn't talk about himself in this much depth. He's a very confident person, but it's nice to dive a bit deeper, and we haven't even cracked a lot of it. There's a lot of still unknowns that we'll say for another episode, I'm sure.
I like this.
Just because we're bloody an hour and 10 minutes in. Value the listener's time more, please, and stop waffling.
You're right.
Be more succinct.
That's part one.
Be more
of my story. No, part two at some point in the next 5 years.
In the future. But thank you so much for listening, and we very much appreciate your time and choosing us as your preferred Formula One podcast.
What a great way to end.
So do you think that there's a potential Oscar to Audi eventually?
No.
You don't think so?
Oscar to Red Bull.
Oscar to Red Bull.
We need all Australian drivers need to drive for Red Bull at some point in their career.
It's the rules.
We don't make the
they
rules
are the
here.
Rules.
That is just the facts. That's like, I don't know what to tell you.
Death taxes driving for Red Bull.
As an Australian F1 driver.
Yes, that's the rules.